Hey, my name is Jamie Aaron. In today's lesson, we're going to be talking about secondary dominant chords, what they are and how to use them. So before we get started talking about secondary dominants, let's just talk about dominance and diatonic harmony. So if we were to take a major scale, like a good old C major scale, and we were to harmonize that scale in chords, we get this natural series of chords called the diatonic series. And I did a video about diatonic harmony on the guitar. If you want to review that or watch it after this, I'll go ahead and link it in the description below. So if we harmonize this major scale, we get this series of seventh chords. C major 7, D minor 7, E minor 7, F major 7, G dominant 7, A minor 7, B minor 7 flat 5, and C major 7. These are the naturally occurring chords in the key of C. Therefore, they're diatonic. Out of all these chords, only one of the chords is a dominant 7 chord, or a major triad with a flatted 7. That's the 5 chord. So if we apply Roman numerals or numbers to each of these chords in order, we get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Then we return to the 1 chord an octave higher. So when we give numbers or Roman numerals to all these chords, our dominant 7 chord is the 5 chord. So let's talk about the purpose of the 5 chord. When the rules of Western classical music theory were being written hundreds and hundreds of years ago, the sound of this chord, a dominant 7 chord, sounded so dissonant, it was the chord that brought about tension that needed to be resolved by returning back to our tonic chord, or our 1 chord. That's why when you hear classical music, you hear a lot of this kind of sound. That's the cadence of the 5 chord going back to a 1 chord. So in essence, the job of the 5 chord is to create tension that gets you back home. It creates the kind of tension that gets you back to landing on the 1 chord, so it sounds like you've gone from dissonance to consonance. You get that sound of returning home to the tonic chord, or the 1 chord. Now fast forward hundreds of years, we can hear a G7 chord, and because of blues and funk and other styles of music, even more contemporary classical composers, we can hear a dominant 7 chord, and it sounds fairly stable. It doesn't sound like it needs to resolve back to 1. But even in today's popular music, a lot of the time, the 5 chord has this purpose of wanting to return back to the 1 chord. So what is a secondary dominant chord? Well, according to these rules, we can only have 1 dominant 7 chord in any key. And that's true. There is only 1 dominant 7 chord that exists in any key. That's the 5 chord. But you've seen songs, I'm sure, where there are dominant 7 chords acting in other roles. Most likely, it's a secondary dominant. And here's how it works. Let's take a diatonic chord progression. This is a chord progression meaning all the chords exist in the key of C. We're going to go from C major 7, the 1 chord, to D minor 7, the 2 chord, to G7, the 5 chord, and back to our 1 chord, C major 7. So what if we swap out that D minor 7 for a D dominant 7? You probably heard this chord progression before, maybe in a Beatles tune. So theoretically, how can we go from a D7 to a G7? Where in our key, we know there's only 1 5 chord, it's going to be G7, and the 5 chord's the only chord that's technically allowed to be a dominant 7. Well, we're thinking of this D7 as the 5 chord of G7. Because if we start on a G chord and we count up 5 notes in that G scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we get D. So what we're doing is we're borrowing this D7 from another key, right? D7 can't exist in our key of C. It has an F sharp. There's no F sharp in a C major scale. C major scale, no sharps, no flats. So we're borrowing this D7 chord, which is the 5 chord in the key of G, as a way to get to this G7. So we're thinking of this as what you might call the 5 of 5. That's what a secondary dominant is. This is the 5 chord of the 5 chord, which gets us back to our 1 chord. Some people might say we're going from 1 to 2 dominant to 5 back to 1. But analyzing it in the way that classical composers did using secondary dominants, we would say we're going from 1 to the 5 of 5 to the 5 chord, to the 1 chord. And it just gives it a different flavor. So you can hear that this D7 wants to go to G7, which wants to take us back home to C. So let's take a look at another chord progression. Here we have a common 1, 6, 2, 5 progression. And diatonically, using just chords that exist in the key of C, C is our 1 chord, A minor is our 6 chord, D minor is our 2 chord, and G7 is our 5 chord. If we wanted to play this up the neck, something more like this. So in this type of harmony in music theory, there's a certain order that chords like to move in, or at least when these people that wrote these rules, they established this is kind of an order. One of those being the 1 chord likes to go to the relative minor, the 6 chord, which likes to go to the 2 chord, which goes to the 5 chord, which goes home. And we often talk about 2-5-1s, right? A 2-5-1 is a great progression to get you somewhere. The 2 chord kind of sets up the progression. The 5 chord is your point of tension. The 1 chord is landing back at home. It's your point of resolution. So a 1-6-2-5 is a cycle or a turnaround that just sort of extends that. But what if we make that 6 chord, that A minor 7, which is diatonic to our key of C, it's the 6th chord. What if we make that a dominant 7 chord? You probably heard that sound before. This is something common in jazz, in a jazz turnaround. You'll find this in many great American songbook jazz standards. Jazz composers often swap out a diatonic 6 chord for a dominant 6 chord. So what's going on here as far as secondary dominance? Well, we're thinking of this A7 as the 5 chord of our 2 chord, which takes us to our 5 chord and back to our 1 chord. So we're still playing 1-6-2-5, but we're thinking of our 6 chord as a dominant chord, which is really functioning as a secondary dominant. Because if our 2 chord is D minor 7, we're setting up that D minor 7 with an A7, and A7 is the 5 chord of D, right? If we take a D and go up 5 notes, this time I'm doing a minor scale because it's a D minor chord, but either way, it's the same 5th. The 5th of D is A7. So we're really going from 1 to the 5 of 2, to the 2 chord, to the 5 chord. But jazz musicians will just call this a 1-6-2-5. And often in jazz, you'll hear that 6 chord will be an altered dominant, or a dominant 7 chord that has a flat 5, sharp 5, flat 9, or sharp 9. And if you want a review about altered chords, altered dominant chords, and the altered scale, I did a video on that. I'll post the link in the description below. So instead of this, we get something that sounds like this. It just makes it a little more interesting, and it brings out a little bit of extra tension, making this chord a dominant chord that sets up that 2 chord. It's the 5 chord of our 2 chord, and then we get to the 5 chord of our 1 chord. So let's apply this now to a big cycle, a big progression. So here's a diatonic chord progression. Check it out. So if we analyze these chords, 1, C major 7, 4, F major 7, 3, E minor 7, 6, A minor 7, 2, D minor 7, 5, G dominant 7, and 1. And this is a typical cycle. The 1 chord often likes to go to the 4, which likes to go to the 3, which likes to go to the 6, which likes to go to the 2, which likes to go to the 5, which likes to go to the 1. But what if we start adding secondary dominants to make this sound a little more interesting and a little more like what you'd hear in the jazz idiom? So when you hear this progression, it sounds like an old hymn or a Christmas tune or something. We're going to make it sound a little more interesting. So we're going to go from our 1 chord to our 4 chord. Now let's use a dominant 3 chord. In this case, I'm going to use an E7 sharp 9. It's that altered sharp 9 sound. Into our A minor. So my 3 chord is now functioning as the 5 chord of my 6 chord. Then I'll go to 2 chord, 5 chord, 1 chord. So this, while it's based off of the third scale degree of the C major 7 E, we're now thinking of this as the 5 chord of A minor. E7 is the 5 chord to A minor, which is my 6th chord. Now what if we make our 6th chord dominant? In this case, adding another altered tone, A7 sharp 5. Check it out. Now my A7 is acting as the 5 chord to my 2 chord, because A is the 5th scale degree of D. We go up 5 notes in a D scale, right? D, E, F, sharp, G, A. A is the 5th. So we're going from the 1 to the 4 to the 5 of 6. Now my 6th chord is the 5 of 2. Into my 2 chord, into my 5 chord, into my 1 chord. Here's how that sounds. But what if now, right, we got our 5 of 6 and our 5 of 2. What if we make the 2 chord dominant 7? Now our 2 chord is the 5 chord of our 5 chord, because D is the 5th of G. So now we have our 1 chord, our 4 chord. Now we're going to make this the 5 chord of the 6 chord, which happens to be the 5 chord of the 2 chord, which happens to be the 5 chord of the 5 chord, which is the 5 chord of the 1 chord. So in each of the chords in this cycle, we're just turning them dominant, and they happen to be the 5 chord of the chord that comes next. E7 is the 5 of my A minor. But if we make my A minor dominant, this is the 5 of my D minor chord, my 2 chord. But let's make that dominant, which is the 5 chord of our 5 chord, which is the 5 chord of the whole thing. 1, 4, dominant 3, which we're thinking of as the 5 of 6, dominant 6, which we're thinking of as the 5 of 2, 2, which we're thinking of as the 5 of 5, into our 5 chord. So now we get something like this. Makes it a little more interesting. But what about making this 4 chord dominant? Let me just do it and hear how it sounds. It sounds really good, but wait a second. F is not the 5 chord of E. So how can we grab this other dominant? Is there a theoretical explanation for how we can use an F7 in our key of C major? And why does this F9 set up this E dominant chord, this E7 sharp 9 so well? Well, if we reduce this F7 chord to the 3rds and 7ths, A is our 3rd, E flat is our flat 7. Now, if we use the process of tritone substitution, meaning any dominant 7 chord can be substituted for another dominant 7 chord whose root is a tritone or a flatted 5th away. So a tritone away from F is B natural. B natural, B7 has the same notes that are the 3rd and 7th of F7. Check it out. Here's F7. And here is B7. So these 2 notes exist as the 3rd and 7th in both chords. In the F chord, this A is the 3rd, and this E flat is the 7th. In my B7 chord, this A is the flat 7, and this E flat, or in this case we'll call it D sharp, is the 3rd. So these chords can be substituted for one another. So if we're playing an F7 here, the tritone of F is B7. So instead of going from my F to my E7 chord, it's really like we're going from a B7 chord to an E7 chord. And guess what? B7 is the 5 chord of E7. So we actually are using that secondary dominant kind of harmony. We're just using a tritone sub. So check it out. I could go from my C major 7 to a B7 sharp 5 to an E7 sharp 9, A7. The function of the harmony is the same. We're just tritone subbing out those roots. Here it is with the F. is with the B. So this F7 chord is actually a tritone sub for the 5 of 3. So we're really going from 1 to the 5 of 3, to the 5 of 6, to the 5 of 2, to the 5 of 5, to the 5 of 1, 5 of our tonic chord, to 1. Now, if you talk to any jazz musician, they'll just say, I'm going 1, 4, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1, because it's often assumed that these chords will usually be some sort of altered dominant. Not always, it depends on the song. So this is how we took a chord progression, very diatonic, and we made it sound a little more interesting. Thank you for watching this lesson. I hope it was helpful. Please like and subscribe. I post lesson videos, gear demos, and performances. And if you'd like a PDF handout of all these chords written out, as well as many other PDF tab lessons, exclusive lesson videos, Zoom get-togethers, and more, check out my Patreon page, which is linked below. Once again, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.